all of those men have multiple victims, right? My argument is that not a single woman should be assaulted because a man got into their space because of self-ID. The correct number of victims of this type of thing is 0. That's the correct number. We will never make that number because men are canny and they get around things and they use everything they can to get into women's spaces.
This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 156 for the 27th of April 2023. I was due to provide a rant for this episode of the Here's How podcast. However, because the interview with Graham is already quite long, William and I agreed to publish without a rant this time. I will be ranting on the next episode of Here's How. One small note before we launch in. Throughout the episode, when individuals are mentioned who may be unfamiliar to people who are not immersed in trans rights debates, William attempts to rewind and give a 1 or 2 sentence explainer describing who these people are in the context of these debates. One that was missed in the episode is Posey Parker, also known as Kelly J. Keane and Kelly J. Keane Minchell, who addressed the recent Let Women Speak event in Belfast. So very briefly, Posey Parker describes herself as a women's rights activist. She has been described by trans rights activists such as the YouTubers ContraPoints and Jessie Gender as highlighting a problematic relationship between the gender critical movement and the far right. This is exemplified by the presence of right-wing groups at her speaking events, although these events were held in public and there is no evidence that Posey Parker invited such groups. Events at which Posey Parker has spoken, including the Belfast event, have been characterised by angry protests from trans rights activists. In a moment we'll have the interview, but first I'd like to thank all the patrons on Patreon who support the podcast. We really appreciate you all, and if you think you can do the same as those patrons and donate the price of a small pack of disposable erasers or a 200-page refill pad once or twice a month, there are details on how to do that on the website and at the end of the show. Also, if you're willing to proselytise to family and friends about the show, that's something you can do for free.
On the line now, I have the creator and writer from Black Books, The IT Crowd, and other shows like Count Arthur Strong, The Walshes, Brass Eye, and most famously Father Ted. And Graham, to borrow, it is of course Graham Linehan, and Graham, to borrow a line from maybe your most famous show, Father Ted, I hear you're a transphobe now. You've been getting very deeply into this issue, but for people who are not so familiar with it and are not so familiar with why you are so passionate with this, can you tell me from first principles how you feel about this issue?
Well, I first noticed that something strange was happening when I wrote an episode about the IT Crowd that included a trans character. And, you know, I treated the character just as I would treat any other character in the show. But yet the kind of response, the pushback was much more, I would say, violent and strange than I'd had before. It was accompanied with, you know, with lots of kind of hyperbolic language and stats about things like murder rates and suicide rates that I just thought, what the hell is this? You know, so, you know, a lot of people told me to, educate myself. And that's kind of that's one of their catchphrases is educate yourself.
Who are they?
Trans rights activists, you know.
Okay.
And I really want to make sure that throughout this interview, it's very clear that I am talking about trans rights activists. I am not talking about trans people. You know, trans people, you know, to take a phrase that's overused in this, are along a spectrum of what they believe and where they are on this issue. There's plenty of trans people on my side, and there's plenty of trans people on the other side. So when I say they, I mean trans rights activists, and I kind of noticed that the pushback was just of a different quality than I'd ever seen before for a joke. So I looked into it, I did the reading, I did the research, and there were a few things that surprised me. Like, for instance, I realized that the phrase trans women are women was meant literally. And And I felt that, again, like everyone else, when you hear that phrase, first of all, it sounds like a good, inclusive principle, you know, and I think it's especially understandable and, you know, almost acceptable. And I'll go into why I say almost in a second, but it's almost acceptable when you're talking about transsexuals, because I think transsexuals have been through a lot, you know. I think they suffer terribly from dysphoria, and it's led them to a path that is just extreme. You know, it's a very extreme path, and I think that we have to, you know, be careful when we're talking about such people. You know, their situation is very unique and different from the vast majority. But I think what I realized the more I looked into it was that because the umbrella of who is and isn't considered trans had widened out to include a huge group of people who don't have very much in common, including cross-dressers like Eddie Izzard, and then you have young 16-year-old girls who are dysphoric and are taking testosterone and having double mastectomies. I realized that the term trans is meaningless, you know, or it had become meaningless. So I went from thinking, you know,
just to pause you on that there, Graham, when you say that it had become meaningless, correct me if I'm wrong, what you mean is that it had come to cover so many different and perhaps disparate things or conditions or types of people that it wasn't really meaningful, or are you saying just that the concept of trans is meaningless?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Now, the former, you know, I'm saying that the word trans has simply has kind of, the word trans itself transitioned to mean something other than what it originally meant. And what I noticed as well was that people on the outside of the argument, on the outside of the debate, they didn't know this. So they thought, and I think this is what happened when I got into the fight, they thought that I had just gone mad and was attacking transsexuals. But the people I was concerned with, the people I was angry about, were trans rights activists, because they were the ones sending abuse to women. And the
pause with that one there for a second. When you say trans rights activists were sending abuse to women, do you mean sending abuse to women in general, or sending abuse to women who perhaps disagreed with their point of view?
Yeah, no, only to women who made a comment about this stuff, you know. And I also noticed that it was being aimed not just at women who were mentioning trans issues, but at women who weren't. And every time a woman started talking about her rights, there'd be, you know, if you looked on Twitter where a lot of this conversation originated, you know, you'd see a reply going, "I hope you're including trans women in this," you know. And when you see that a number of times, you realize, well, wait a sec, now trans women includes people like Eddie Izzard. So no, I don't think Eddie Izzard should be going into women's toilets and getting onto female.
Okay, I'm going to get to that topic in a moment, but I just want to kind of establish the ground rules here. You said that you got, and you used the word violent reaction to an episode of the IT Crowd. When you say that, I take it you don't mean actual violence, that you mean that there was a very strong reaction to it.
Yeah, but the language has always been hyperbolic. Like, for instance, India Willoughby just the other day did a video where they talked about...
India Willoughby is a relatively well-known, I think, am I correct, a trans person and also a trans rights activist from the UK?
Yes.
Okay.
And Willoughby used to be, like a lot of transsexuals in this, Willoughby used to be halfway sane. But like recently, they've adopted the kind of hyperbolic side, and the other day Willoughby was talking about transgenocide, you know. It's language like this, it's words like this, it's a kind of heightened, hysterical, frightened discourse that some people some trans rights activists are using quite cynically, I think, and others, I would argue a lot of, for instance, young trans men are not necessarily engaging in, but are being influenced by. So when someone like Willoughby says transgenocide, that's going to make a whole group of very vulnerable, very troubled people think that someone's coming to get them, you know? Whereas in fact, you know, all the fight, you know, I was just in Belfast for the Posey Parker event, and the whole thing is just set up to maintain principles around safeguarding, around women's rights that have been in place for 100 years, So the idea
okay,
that
Graham,
yeah.
pause with that for a moment, because I'm aware that you're very deeply into this particular issue, as are not a few other people, but many listeners might not have that depth of knowledge that you have and that sort of background. So I want to start from first principles on this. And one of the things that you mentioned there, which is you talked about trans rights activists perhaps catastrophizing and using this term that you said, transgenocide, that this person, India Willoughby, mentioned. And I think from your point of view, just in general, it's reasonable to say that there are people there who are perhaps hyping up the opposition to their point of view in an effort to perhaps attract attention, in an effort maybe to justify their own beliefs that may be otherwise seen as very extreme, and to just basically wind up the issue a little bit. But would you agree that if I was talking to somebody, and you mentioned your side of the argument, would you agree that if I was talking to somebody who was in your position on the other side of the argument, they could equally point to people who were talking against trans rights, to use that umbrella? I'm going to analyse that a little bit further later on, but who were using language that was either outright hostile or perhaps written in a way such as to be ambiguous about how, the degree to which trans people would be able to just live their lives and be allowed to just exist in society. Do you think that there exists that on both sides of the argument?
Well, here's the difference. I do think there are people on our side who are like that, but they are the fringe and they're the extremes. They're the very extremes. Some of them are traumatized women who do not like men for very good reasons. Some of them are just kind of
so some people who are on what you call your side, you're saying, are perhaps women who have been traumatized or been perhaps victims of sexual assault or something, and don't want anything that looks like a male anywhere near them. Am I right?
Yes, and also there's radical feminists who separate feminists radical separate lesbians who also for political reasons just don't want to have anything to do with that. But here's the key part about that. They are like small fringe groups that aren't really part of the main thrust of modern feminism. The problem with violent trans rights activism is that it's mainstream.
I'm going to slow you down on the word, Graham. I'm going to slow you down on the word violent there. When you say violent, do you mean actual violence, or do you mean people who are using language that is perhaps inappropriately strong, or using violent imagery or violent language?
Violent language that is leading to violent results. When I was in Belfast, a gay man who was with us was headbutted by a member of staff. When I was in New Zealand, a woman in her 70s was punched by a young man. So the two are feeding each other. The violent language. Yeah,
violent language absolutely can lead to actual violence, but I think it's important that we have a clear discussion and that we distinguish between the two. But I take your point, and I don't want to minimize those two incidents, but in the context of war in Europe and in the context even just of what you might come into after a closing time on a Saturday night, that's not an awful lot of violence, really, is it?
Well, yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, you're a man. I'm a man. We don't know what it's like to receive death and rape threats. But J.K. Rowling certainly knows what it's like. So does Julie Bindel. So does Kathleen Stock. Kathleen Stock quit her job after she
to slow down there. Everybody will know who J.K. Rowling is. She's the author of the Harry Potter books and others. Julie Bindel is quite a well-known public academic and feminist in Britain. And Kathleen Stock formerly was a professor at, I think, the University of Sussex in the UK. She is a lesbian, and she took essentially a feminist line that did not include trans women, that's to say men who have transitioned to be women, that did not include them as women, and was the subject of very active protests at her university, which led to her essentially leaving her job. Tell me what you were going to say about them.
Well, she left her job when she was walking to work one day, and she saw posters all along the way calling for her head, basically, And it's like the thing that draws the last two people, Bindle and Stock, together is that they're lesbians, you know? And I simply cannot understand why progressives do not see how homophobic it is for lesbians to be told that they must accept male-bodied people as sexual partners. That is like a major, major part of trans rights activism. And it's pure homophobia. It's pure homophobia. So when you say that, you know, to be honest with you, William, I think you're downplaying a little bit the extent of the problem. The violence of the language and the violence of the reaction. Like you said, I don't know if you saw it the other day, but Judy Blume, she is a writer, an author, and a very famous one, I think. And she wrote, she was interviewed and she said, I support J.K. Rowling 100%. Almost the next day, there was a terrified statement from her. And, you know, from being in this fight myself, I know exactly what she went through. She went through, you know, letters, letter campaigns, violent abuse, friends and family.
We're rolling down. Graham, I'm going to pause on that. When you say violent abuse, the violence you're referring to is language.
Death and rape threats.
Okay.
Death and rape threats. If death and rape threats were done to black people, I don't think you'd be questioning it so much.
No, I'm not. But I think that precision is important here, and that we need to be exact in what we're saying.
But here's the thing: basically, misogyny at the moment, violent misogynistic language is acceptable in a way that violent racist language is not acceptable. Misogyny is sort of fashionable at the moment. And, you know, I just think that so I just think that when we're talking about violence, you know, the kind of, the mainstream of, trans rights activism is full of terms like punch a turf, stab a turf, arm trans people. I don't know if you've seen that. That's a big one. And it's like, it's just, and I think the reason for that is because trans rights activism has been hijacked by a kind of cohort of just straight white males.
Okay, pause with that, because I understand this is something that you're very, very passionate about, and I want to be able to maybe take some of the passion out. And no, you're not going to ask me any questions because I want to put a particular thought to you.
Why aren't you passionate about it? Like for instance, in things like women's sports, like why aren't you passionately defending fair sports for women? Why aren't you passionately defending safe spaces for women? That's the thing that always befuddles me. I don't understand why every man who has a woman in their life is not standing up for them.
Okay, I understand what you're saying, and I want to leave that question as a point rather than try to address it. But it's a reasonable point to make. But I want to just go back to. I just want to go back to understanding the issue very precisely, because I think one of the difficulties here is that actually oftentimes the language can be so extreme. I'm not accusing you of that, but oftentimes the language used can be so extreme that it actually obscures understanding on this.
Yes,
and
agreed.
You said, for example, that if the language and the hostility online, which certainly exists, and I have certainly seen that, if that existed towards, for example, black people, then that would have been viewed as unacceptable. Can you understand that, and gun control in the US is a big issue in the United States? California is one of the states that perhaps is paraded as being more progressive as this because it has quite restrictive gun laws by American standards. The reason it has restrictive laws by American standards is because in the 1960s and the early 70s, Black Power protesters said, hey, hang on a second, we're allowed to have any gun we want, and they started walking around with AK-47s without ever shooting anybody, without ever even aiming at anybody. But Black Panther and Black Power protesters with AK-47s gave off a much more challenging visage to people who were threatening them physically. And that is the origin. It was for that reason that gun rights were restricted to the degree that they are in California. It was to prevent black people from essentially walking openly with large weapons.
Sure.
And can you see that there's a parallel there? That there are some trans people who feel under extreme attack, and they feel that they are in danger all the time, and even if they are not genuinely in physical danger, they feel that there is a violent rhetoric against them, as well as what you have described that's perhaps against feminists and people who take, as you put it, your side of the argument. And could you maybe have the charity to understand that, real or not, and you don't have to comment on whether you think it's real or not, they have a genuine fear that they are under real physical threat, not threat of having mean things said about them, or not threat of having violence threatened against them, but under actual real physical threat.
I get where you're going. Okay, so I'll answer. This is a rhetorical question, but who do you think is making them feel like that? India Willoughby saying there's a trans genocide, or Kathleen Stocks saying that lesbians don't have penises? Who is the person who is causing that fear and who is causing that reaction from people?
Okay, can I just then draw your attention to, for example, at CPAC, which is the Conservative Political Action Committee. This is a mainstream conservative event in the United States. This is by no means fringe. This is where all of the American Republican presidential candidates and many more minor candidates would come to network and so forth. CPAC, it's called. And Michael Knowles, who I think is a commentator on Fox News, said, and this is a direct quote, he said, "Transgenderism must be eradicated from public life." Now, what I think, pause, I want to give you a precise question on this. What I think Michael Knowles is doing there is he is being calculatedly ambiguous. So when he says transgenderism must be eradicated from public life, what he's doing is he is telegraphing the strongest possible threat of violence that he could against trans people, while still maintaining a little escape route for himself to be able to say, oh, no, I didn't mean to attack any actual individuals. I'm just against this ideology. That's what he's doing, isn't it?
I think Michael Knowles is probably trying to draw more attention to himself. But what does he have to do with liberal left-wing feminists in the UK who are being threatened with violence?
That's a good question, but the connection to this particular point is that there are people there who, at the very best, are being portrayed as being attackable, killable, or possibly so. And those lines are cheered to the rafters in conservative circles in the United States. And if you were the target group of that, I would put it to you, Graham, you would feel very, very threatened like that. And, you're Irish, but you've lived in Britain for a long time. If you had been in Britain in the 1970s, had some Enoch Powell type figure saying and being cheered to the rafters, saying Irishness must be eradicated, which was not far from what he was saying, you would feel very much under attack. You would feel very much under attack on that, and he might be able to preserve an escape route of saying, oh no, I didn't mean exactly to attack Irish people, I just want to eradicate Irishness. But that might not be what a few drunk lads coming out of a pub, coming across somebody who was in their target group, might think of that.
Okay. Well, I would argue that it would be more like if you want to make an actual comparison, it would be more like he would say Irishism should be eradicated. If Irish people were going on and saying everyone is, we're Irish, we demand our right to British passports, demand blah 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 blah, then that would be a comparable thing. But it's interesting that you talk about it. I do agree that he is operating in a kind of what would you call it? A kind of a space where he can be appreciated by scumbags, but also people who are concerned about things like child transition, right? I agree he's in that space, but that is the problem with the word trans. The word trans is meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. It used to mean transsexuals.
Well, perhaps it means several things.
It means several things and it means nothing. Because if trans covers my friend Debbie Hayden, who transitioned about 10 years ago, heard about transitioning, could not get it out of I use male pronouns with Debbie and he understands why. Could not get it out of his head until he castrated himself and identified as a woman. It absolutely devastated his family, and he went on Stella O'Malley's show to show how much the decision cost his family. He's a brave man. He's a brave and good man. He has nothing to do with Eddie Izzard. He is no, and please don't interrupt me. Please let me use Eddie Izzard as a good, because he's the perfect comparator. He is a man who used to say, they're not women's clothes, they're my clothes. And we were all on his side. He was progressive. We just thought we all thought it was great. It was like, yes, absolutely, fire away. Knock yourself out. But then, when this became a kind of fashionable stance, he decided that he was, inverted commas, trans, to such an extent that he actually said that if he was alive during the Nazi years, they would have put him in a camp. This is a blonde, white, straight man. So when this guy says transgender,
that's not so fantastic, is it? Transsexual people be they white, straight, blue-eyed or not, they were the first targets of the Nazis. Perhaps I should not say the first targets.
He's not transsexual. He's a cross-dresser.
Yeah, but can you explain? I'm not sure that the people who were very early targets of the Nazis, I shouldn't say the first targets, I'm not sure that the people who were very early targets of the Nazis would have made much headway explaining that to somebody in the SS. But roll that back.
No, all they have to do is put on men's clothes. It's a ridiculous argument, and it's an insult to the gay people and the people who died during the Holocaust. It's that kind of victimology that a lot of people like Izzard and more the well-known trans-identified men are engaging in, And it's outrageous, William. You must admit that's outrageous,
On the scale of outrageous, I find a lot of outrages that I could put a long way above that. But pause on that for a minute.
When Eddie needs a job with Steven Spielberg, do you think he goes dressed as a woman?
I have no idea, and I don't care.
He doesn't, because because he wants to be taken seriously by Steven Spielberg. But when he's at the Labour Party conference, he dresses as a woman because it gains him sympathy and it makes people think that he's part of a protected group. He's not. He's just a transvestite.
Graham. So what?
So what? He's trying to get into women's spaces. He's destroying women's sports. Rapists are going into women's prisons. That's so what, William?
Okay. Pause. Graham, pause for a second. I am entirely, and I will, and I think it is important to discuss, for example, males, particularly males convicted of raping women, being put into a women's prison, and I think that's no males. Even if you stole a dog, you're not absolutely
into a women's prison.
Yes, I understand that.
Women in prison. No, William, come on.
Okay.
I want to finish this point. Women in prison are extremely vulnerable. 40% of women in prison have had blunt force trauma. They did a study. 40% of women who are in prison have had blunt force trauma delivered to them by a partner. Okay? This is a vulnerable group of women. They're often not in there for the same kind of crimes that men are. And the prison population of women versus men is massively fewer women than men.
It's about 5%.
Yes. So you put a man in that environment, you immediately change the whole nature of the environment.
Graham, can I follow up on that then? Accepting most of what you say on that, and I think anyone who has any sense can see why that is problematic, even if they disagree on how to deal with it. But my point is that Eddie Izzard isn't a rapist. Eddie Izzard, you can disagree with him. You can say that he is on the grift a little bit and that he is using his one side of his identity to get work in one way and another side of his identity to get work in another way. And you can even morally disapprove of that. But Eddie Izzard isn't responsible for women potentially being raped while they're in prison or raping women in women's toilets. You disagree?
I think it's.
How so?
Yes, because at the Labour Party conference he was pictured coming out of the women's toilets. He's using women's toilets, he's using women's spaces, he's normalising the same thing that put Adam Graham, a double rapist, into a woman's prison. It's that simple. I don't see how it can be argued. I don't see how the opposite side can be argued.
Then pause with that for a second. There are then, and the word is again borrowed from racial divisions. There is the term passing, which a lot of listeners may not understand. I'm sure you know what it is, Graham, but essentially there will be trans women who are not visibly male and who essentially, by their outward look, and nobody would guess that they were born male. And that can be to a very, very extreme extent. I think I won't go through naming people. But are you saying that any trans woman ever going into a woman's toilets, even when that person would look enormously out of place going into a men's toilets, any trans woman going into a women's toilets bears responsibility for women being raped in women's toilets, or yes, men being put? Yes, you're saying yes.
Yes, I am. Certainly at the current moment, one of the big problems about all this is that trans people, there used to be a kind of allyship between trans women and men. Trans women and women. Mm-hmm. That's been devastated by these activists that have made trans a political identity. So at the moment, in the same way that I will not use male-female pronouns for my friend Debbie, mm-hmm. I have to have a completely, no, sorry, this is the line you do not cross. And another, two more trans friends of mine, Fionn Orlander and Miranda Yardley, they set up a petition to ask the government for third spaces. And they were completely ignored by the trans community. Because they don't want third spaces. They want a lot of these people, these people, it sounds like a very loaded thing, but I'm talking mm-hmm. again about trans rights activists. Mm-hmm. A lot of trans rights activists, they want to invade these spaces. It is a domination. It is a power thing. And, unfortunately.
How do you know? How do you see into their heart?
Because they say it. They say it online, I mean, and you talk about seeing into their heart. I don't need to see into their heart. I just need to know, is a man in a woman's space? Then no, you shouldn't be in here, And I believe it's also the duty of every man who, if they see a man going into a woman's space, so sorry, that's the ladies,
Oh, okay, and what if that, as you term it, man, trans woman, who is absolutely short of a chromosomal test, or at least short of removing their clothes in public, is absolutely undetectable as having been born male and it presents entirely as a woman?
That's up to the individual, Like there's a phrase, the good men stay out, so the bad men stand out. And I think that when you say like
roll that back, I want you just to explain that saying.
In terms of female spaces, the good mm-hmm. men stay out, so the bad men stand out. So
in other words, the men voluntarily don't enter, so that points to the bad men who would enter makes them more salient.
Yeah. And I'd also say that, like, in terms of who is suffering here, in simple terms of numbers, it always seems to me that these incredible passing trans women who I've heard about but very rarely see.
Sure, it's an extremely small number of people.
Sure. And, that comes down to whatever, that's like an individual decision that people have to make and people have to live with themselves.
And quite possibly you don't notice because you don't notice.
Sure. But, if you're talking about people like Katie Montgomery and mm-hmm. Blair White and all these mm-hmm. people, they're always photographed using filters and all sorts of things. And then, when you see them in real life, Katie Montgomery, for instance, I think is nearly as tall as me, mm-hmm. So she's, sorry, I won't say he or she here. How could I do this? One of the aspects of why trans has risen to such an extent in the last few years is because people are able to present a version of themselves that's completely at odds with the truth. I don't know whether you remember that. I can't remember if I always forget. It's something like "No one knows you're a dog" on the internet.
Yeah, from a New York Times cartoon.
Yes, exactly. So there's a kind of a what would you call it? There's a kind of almost like a magic spell that's very easily created, which is simply you put a woman's name in your avatar, or in your profile. You do that, and suddenly people are like, I get it all the time. I get people saying, Graham Linehan's a misogynist, And it's like, well, how am I misogynist? And sometimes you see a person, someone come up, their name is Mallory or Jennifer or, Starcup or something like that. And then you see the photograph and, it's a bloke, it's a bloke making absolutely no effort. There's nothing about them that is, what you and I would probably consider.
Hold on. I'm sorry, I have to stop you on that one. And I understand what you're saying about the kind of the validity, but making no effort is really, I think, a difficult thing to say about that, because that is language that was used against feminists, particularly lesbians, that, go on, darling, if you only put a bit of makeup on, you wouldn't look so bad.
We're talking about men.
I know,
but about men, William.
Is anybody, male or female, required to meet a particular standard, let alone a particular beauty standard, in order to be considered,
William,
what they are?
There's men on lesbian dating apps who look like me. They look like me, William. They're making no effort, and they're just putting she, her in their bio, and they're invading these spaces for lesbians. Again, why isn't everyone fighting this?
Okay, I get your frustration, and I can hear the passion and the emotion that you have invested in this.
But why don't you share it, William? Why don't you share? What, for instance, like a woman, like 2 women have been beaten up in the ring in MMA fights. Why does that not make you want to? Pick up
I would put it to you. What you're referring to is that one trans woman, a male who transitioned to be a woman, took part in MMA, which is no, Graham, because you're very deep into this, and I want to give people the full background on this. MMA is mixed martial arts, is a particularly violent form of combat sport, and this person competed against 2 separate women and injured both of them quite severely in the ring. I put it to you, Graham, that of female MMA fighters, more than 2 of them have been injured severely, and they...
Not by men, William.
Does that make a difference?
Yes, of course it does. The top swimmer, Leah Thomas, in the women's section, was number 200 or something when he was in the male section. These are mediocre men who are beating up, someone like Fallon Fox. He broke a woman's orbital bone. Not only that, he didn't tell them he used to be a man. He didn't tell them. There's a reason why we have sex segregation. It's to protect women. I don't understand.
Well, Graham, pause on that. So, first of all, one question that I put out on the podcast, and I think that's all that I can do, is I said that in these instances, for example, contact sports, the reason for the segregation in the first place is because of biological differences. And the people who you refer to as they, trans rights activists, don't seem to have any difficulty with segregating by gender. That is to say, having people who identify as female or man or woman being sent into one category or another. But it is not gender. It is not the reason for the segregation that you have men's boxing and women's boxing. The reason you don't have a man going up against Katie Taylor is because of the biological differences between males and females. And I can understand that entirely. And I have made that point very forcefully. And I have made the point that trans rights activists have not been able to, at least within my hearing, explain why they're okay with gender segregation when they seem to think that sex segregation is an unacceptable form of discrimination. And I have made that point. But I can hear that you're very passionate about this, Graham, and very, I think, exasperated that more people aren't on your side and more people aren't shouting from the rooftops as I think you feel you are. But can I just put it to you that it might be the case that people who would be shouting from the rooftops with you are kind of put off that, partly by the stridency of some trans rights activists, but also maybe partly by the stridency of yourself and other people who are, as you put it, on your side.
Because we can't believe you're not helping. We can't believe you're not helping, William. We can't believe that you're letting women be hurt in prison, that you're letting women be hurt in sports. We can't believe it. It drives us insane. Yes, I'm completely going insane about this, but Arthur Matthews and Neil Hannon pulled out of a musical rather than work with me.
Okay,
you know?
roll back. Who are Arthur Matthews and Neil Hannon? These are people involved with the production company Hat Trick
Arthur Matthews wrote Father Ted with me, and Neil Hannon did the music. And rather than say, well, hang on a sec, yes, this is a kind of important issue, and Graham's been suffering ever since he started speaking about this, rather than saying that, they pulled out, they agreed with the Hat Trick bosses to try and get rid of me from the musical. They tried to give me, Hat Trick tried to give me £200,000 to step away from it.
Okay.
And I refused, even though it would have made me rich. I refused because I just can't accept that I need to sacrifice women's safety for the sake of my musical.
Okay.
I just can't accept it.
We're coming in the middle of a story, which is kind of what I'm trying to avoid here, Graham,
Sure.
which is that you were a very, very successful television writer and developer. Your career has essentially come to a standstill.
As it does for everyone.
Okay, and you mentioned those two individuals, and what I want to do is Graham, I have a question. Graham, pause. I have a question. Graham, I'm not.
No, William, I want to loop back to what you were saying.
Okay.
When you talk about the stridency and the anger and the what might seem like we hear it a lot. Two sides. The two sides are at fault. It's simply because there are no adults in the room. Everything has to be discovered before it's stopped. For instance, for years, Mermaids, the child transition charity, were saying that some children are born in the wrong body. As soon as that became popularly known, as soon as that became transmitted in a wider way, they immediately said, "Oh, of course we don't mean that children are born in the wrong body." They are doing all this stuff kind of in the dark because adults won't enter into the room, because people like Arthur and Neil won't say, "Of course women need safe spaces. Of course women need fair sports." That's all we're looking for. If a few more people just said that, I wouldn't be shouting into a computer right now,
Okay, pause on that for a second, because I don't want to personalize this to any particular individuals, and in particular not to the people who you've named. But when you say that, as you have, and I've talked to you previously, and you've said that your career has come to somewhat of a standstill over that, is it your impression that the people who are not engaging with you professionally are doing so because they personally feel that you're wrong on this, or because they don't particularly disagree with you, but they are afraid of the blowback?
Oh, it's a chilling effect that comes from all of that, and also, again, another part of the reason is that another part of the adults being in the room is that the media misrepresents what we're doing. Like, for instance, the Belfast Telegraph, I think it was a Belfast newspaper. It had a subhead on the Posey Parker event. And it said that a women's rights event was counter-protest by pro-trans event. Women's rights was in scare quotes, and pro-trans wasn't.
Okay. Pause on this. Graham, because we have to give people background to this. This was
William.
Okay, go ahead.
My point. That kind of putting the finger on the scales exists all through this. The Guardian, it only reports on the Tavistock when it absolutely had to. This is a major, major medical scandal. Thousands of children have been misdiagnosed, have had operations that were needless because they were gay or autistic. The Guardian won't report on it. There is a blackout on news around this. And I think it's caused by, within every organization, there are a number of trans rights activists who are threatening everyone else with being transphobic. You've often seen The Guardian hilariously gets called transphobic, even though they try to avoid this issue as much as they can.
Okay, but Graham, I haven't often seen that, and I think many listeners haven't often seen that because they're not Guardian readers and they're not as deeply into that issue as you are. And I think the event that you were talking about was when you recently and Posey Parker and some other people had a Let Women Speak rally, which was counter-protested by trans rights activists in Belfast. But what I want to essentially get into is that I think, and I think you might agree with me, that what are called trans people is quite possibly a collection of several different demographics or several different cohorts which are being labelled together. And I don't want to comment on the percents, but I don't think it is a large percent. But there is certainly a number of sex offenders who have post-offending announced that they are trans and yeah, that is true. And that is perhaps motivated by a variety of things, perhaps sexual interest and perhaps also just the desire to get into an easier prison system. But aside from that, there are entirely different cohorts of people who do not interfere with anybody else's lives. And perhaps another cohort again is young, that is to say teenage girls who are frequently lesbian, frequently autistic. And you mentioned the Tavistock Clinic. That is the UK. It is being closed. It's in the process of being closed down as we speak. But it is the UK clinic which was dealing with trans youth. And I think you're clear enough that you think, I might be correct that there are different cohorts there that are being brought in under one label, perhaps inappropriately. But the question I would put to you is that when I listen to your rhetoric and when I read what you've read, if I was in any one of those cohorts, with the possible exception of the sex offenders, that would definitely make me feel like binding more closely to all the others and identifying them with them more strongly, because what you write and the tone that you take sometimes seems to be a very unfocused attack. And you can rightly say...
Can you give me an example?
That I will in a moment, and I don't want to be provocative on this, but you can point to problems and things that are perhaps obviously wrong, obvious to anybody who looks at it in detail. But isn't it the case that you're failing to distinguish between those cohorts? And just to take it on a moral level, whether you're talking about Irish people in Britain or black people in the US or trans people anywhere in the world, even if every single one of them was a serial killer minus one, then that one person is still entitled to full respect and their human rights and to be treated like a human being. Isn't that true?
Yeah, but women are not. Women have to accept men in their spaces because of that one person?
Those are not necessarily contradictory.
How? They're losing their sports. They're losing their safe spaces. They're even trying to change the language. They're trying to make words like woman and mother unsayable. They're replacing it with terms like cervix haver and uterus haver. They being trans rights activists, but also trans rights activists who work within some of the major charities and CEOs. Stonewall gave the Scottish government points for taking the word mother out of official NHS documents. You must see that's wrong, William. And William,
I do, yeah.
Any frustration that I have, and any time that I do not express myself with the decorum that people require of me, even though the other side issues death and rape threats every day, it can be explained by the fact that, and I'm sorry, William, but you're not helping. You're not helping progressive left-wing people who say that they're feminists, who say that they're feminist allies, are not helping. They are completely ignoring women in prison. They're completely ignoring the women fighting this in sports. I don't know if you saw that woman, Riley Gaines in America, who's chased down a corridor and punched by people because she's arguing for fair sports. Why aren't people helping?
Sports are inherently unfair.
Why is it just me? Why am I the only person with a profile like mine still talking about this after 5 years, when we've seen that children are being mutilated, we've seen that children are being misdiagnosed, we've seen that women are suffering in prison and in other spaces, we've seen that women are losing their livelihoods for standing up to it all. Why aren't people helping, William? If I'm going mad because of this debate, it's because everybody betrayed women. Everybody just turned their back. When it was fashionable to be feminist, they said they were feminists. But as soon as it wasn't fashionable, dead silence on all these matters. And again, if my kind of scattergun approach is, as you say, unfocused, it's because I have to be across all of it, because no one else is talking about it. And there's so many aspects to this that it is, okay. There's going to be, William, when in a few years, right, when, for instance, these young girls who've been told they'll turn into men if they cut off their breasts, when those girls realize that they've been tricked, there's going to be a mental health crisis along with the medical crisis that's being created. And I just don't understand why people aren't fighting it with every bit of their energy and passion. Why aren't they doing it, you know? And in 10 years, those young girls are going to look at the people who were silent and they're going to say, where were you?
Okay, can I maybe just suggest, I've mentioned this to you previously, but you have been banned. You are now, according to Twitter, even more extreme than Donald Trump, because you have been banned from Twitter twice. I don't want to get into that in too much detail.
But sarcastic joke.
Yeah, but for example, you took aim at H from Steps. And no, hold on for a second, Graham. This is a tweet that you put up and you never took it down until it was taken down by the Twitter ban. And I don't want to go into the detail of all of it. Hold on for a second. No, Graham, because I didn't
take that down. That's still up.
No, it's not.
That tweet.
Your account was taken down, so by that token, it's taken down.
William,
you didn't.
William,
that's my point. No, but I'm going to,
William,
Graham. I want to tell that.
No, I won't have it, William. You're lying. You're lying. William, I was not taken down. That tweet is still there, right? I was taken down because a trans rights activist sent me a typically disingenuous tweet, and I replied to it sarcastically, and Americans don't get sarcasm, so they banned me for a day, William.
Okay.
Please don't talk about things if you don't know what you're talking about. It's really annoying, and it makes things more dangerous for me, William. When you said stuff like that.
I'll take that on board. But let me just have a look at what you actually wrote, because there is, and I don't want to go in too deep into the weeds of this, but there are various add-ons and plugins that you can get for Twitter, and somebody had the time on their hands to make a plugin for Twitter that essentially filters out people like you and J.K. Rowling and anybody else who tweets tweets that would not be.
A pedophile code.
That's as it may be. Nevertheless, H from Steps, and you've talked about homophobia on this. H from Steps is a gay man. There's absolutely nothing to suggest he is anything other than an upright and honourable individual.
Except that he bans feminists. Except that every single feminist who goes to his page finds that they've been blocked by him.
And which he's absolutely entitled to do.
Yeah. So why? Why is he banning feminists? Why does he not want women who believe
he doesn't need to explain that
single-sex spaces to contact him? He doesn't need to explain it. But all I did was I said, this man is using a piece of software that was probably designed by David Challoner, who is a child rapist who is now in prison for 24 years. David Challoner was the father of Amy Challoner, who had a central role in Stonewall while they were pushing self-ID across the country. It's an important thing to bring to his attention. And if I need to grab his attention by doing that, I will. And I didn't say he was connected to him in a very real way. I said, this is the connection he has to this guy.
Okay, hold on for a second, and I'm going to read the tweet out verbatim. You had a picture of that developer who, as you said, is in prison for very, very serious sexual assault convictions, and a picture of H from Steps. And the exact text of your tweet, of the first tweet on that, was, let's talk about H from Steps and what may connect him to a man serving 22 years for raping and torturing a 10-year-old girl. That's outrageous, Graham. And I'm sure it's not the greatest outrage going, but that doesn't win you any friends.
Women are being placed in prisons with men, rapists. They are being beaten up in their sports. And you think it's outrageous for me to point out that this man used a piece of software by a paedophile.
Well, outrageous probably doesn't help the argument.
Outrageous is what is your way of trying to deflect attention from the fact that you are not helping those women in prison, that you are not campaigning with us to stop this nonsense. You know, that's what you're doing. You're just deflecting, I'm afraid, William, because it makes you feel that you have some sort of moral superiority to pick out a single tweet for me where again, my frustration and anger at this situation is coming out. I am sick of the way these men are able to, man like David Challoner, the worst scumbag, when the worst tortured a little girl in the attic of his home, and he is controlling the flow of information. Yes, I want to point that out to celebrities, because I don't think H from Steps is a bad person. I think he's just, like everybody else in this fight, a useful idiot. So all I can do is keep saying...
Okay, take that point, Graham. Graham, take that point.
Men by not fighting against this.
Okay, take that point. I don't think that H. Seps is a bad person either. And I don't think you're a bad person either. But I think that H. Seps is probably someone who has devoted drastically less attention to this topic than you have. You can say that you should, and that could well be valid, but I'm pretty sure that that's not the case. And if you want H. Seps or a million other people who he represents who are like him to come to your side, that's probably the worst possible way you could do it.
I was talking to onlookers. I wanted onlookers to realize what was happening. I wanted onlookers to realize one of the reasons why celebrities are so stupid around this subject, because they've actually siloed themselves away from the information that they need to make a correct decision. It's an important aspect of this, William. You know, and again, sure, maybe I thought the may in that sentence would prevent conversations like this, but what I've discovered is nothing presents conversations like this, because individual tweets can be cherry-picked, they can be removed of context, and they can be just used against me. I have given up worrying about that, but, you know, I guess it's nice to be able to fight back against it in person. But
sure, like, I understand. Again, Graham, I understand your frustration. Graham, I understand.
Help out. You know, interview female sports stars. Have you interviewed Helen Joyce, who wrote the book Trans, is Irish, and was completely ignored by the Irish literary, community when her book came out. It's one of the most important books on this subject. You know, get those people onto the show. You know, all I'm saying is we're still isolated. We're lied about. They put women's rights in scare quotes. You know, I can't get, if I do a TV program, there'll be a letter writing campaign to get me taken off it. And all I'm saying is that we need to stand up for women. Why aren't people helping?
Okay. Again, I'm going to leave that as a point, and that's a very valid point. But what I want to do is I want to get to a point where listeners have a good understanding of what you're saying. And I have to say, Graham, one of the obstacles to that sometimes is yourself, because you're not presenting, you're kind of going into the middle of arguments that people might not understand the start of, and that can be difficult for people to internalize. And you can sometimes, I think, be hostile to the wrong targets. And
I think you said sometimes you pick one tweet and, you know, if you can find me 2 or 3 more, I'd love to know them. But every target I've gone against has apart from H, has come at women. You know, I will forever criticize people like the comedians Aisling Bea, Carriot Lloyd, and Sarah Pascoe for writing letters of condemnation about J.K. Rowling. Those letters were based on nothing. You know, and I think it's disgusting that they joined in the harassment campaign against them. There are people out there who make me very angry because of the way they've behaved during this. And yeah, that anger is going to come out sometime. But for God's sake, if people want to calm this conversation down, they have to enter it. They have to enter it and start speaking themselves, you know? And if that happens, I've said this to many people, if that happens, I'll be able to get back to doing comedy, you know? But at the moment, journalists aren't doing their job, politicians aren't doing their job. You know, they're all just either pretending they believe in fantasy, like Keir Starmer saying 1% of women have a penis, or they're actively trying to stop these women from speaking. You know, it'll never. It's the strangest thing I've ever experienced. It'll never stop confusing me. What happened to progressivism that they just abandoned women?
Okay, can I then just put to you a different point? And I've mentioned on this podcast before that there's an awful lot of opinionated news on the internet, and I made the point that if you have look at some site very firmly on the right, perhaps in the US like Breitbart, there won't be an immigrant who gets so much as a parking ticket without it being blasted all over Breitbart about immigrants causing crime. And on the other side of the house, if you look at Huffington Post or something else like that, if an immigrant kid gets so much as a gold star on their homework, that will be written up as a heartwarming story and so forth. And one of the things that is happening when we have such a siloed opinion, when we have such siloed opinions on the internet, is that if you consume only one side of that opinion divide, it's very easy to get a very, very skewed view of the world. And if you then take a glance at the other side, it can feel incredibly unreasonable to the point that your whole worldview is under attack. And one of the things that you've got on your website here, on your Substack, is keeping track of trans people or people who may or may not be trans who have been accused of or convicted of sexual assault or some other sex crime. And that's, I'm obviously don't have the resources to research them all, but I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and presume that you're 100% correct.
We have to be.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and the libel laws in the UK are not quite as strict as in Ireland, and you'd be likely to be ruined if you got that wrong.
And also our sources are usually just newspaper pieces, you know?
Yeah, sure. But can you take my point that for the overwhelming number of trans people who are in no way sex offenders, and nothing like it would never come within a million miles of that, that listing like that can feel like something like Breitbart listing Graham, address the point. That can feel like an attack.
What about the women? What about the women? What about the women having their single-sex spaces taken away? They are being put. That whole piece is called "This Never Happens." The reason it's called that is because trans rights activists say there's no problem with self-ID, and we have over 100 examples of it being a problem. Now, I have
roll back. Does self-ID invest?
They think it's important too.
Okay, Graham, does self-ID exist in England and Wales?
No, but it does. There's a shadow version of it because Stonewall have told institutions all over the UK that the law is different than what it is.
Oh, okay, so but a lot of those cases,
in all but name.
Okay, but it doesn't exist in England or Wales, and it doesn't exist in the US. And large.
It does in individual spaces. It does. I'm constantly posting reports. I did one from Norwich the other day of a gym where a man is using the women's gym, even though it says that they're sex segregated. So it's not sex segregated.
Okay. Are you sure that self-ID, that's to say, trans people being recognised as trans on the basis of their own say-so without any medical questioning of that, are you sure that contributes to that?
No, wait. Men being accepted as women. It's very different to what you just said, William.
Okay.
You know,
is it not the case that an awful lot of the cases that you list exist without that?
Oh, this is they're going to get raped anyway, so why make it safer for them? You know, they just discovered, I don't know whether you saw, but there's like a fucking rape epidemic in the NHS. Something like 33 rapes a week that haven't been prosecuted. A study just came in done by Sex Matters. You know, it doesn't need to be made easier. It needs to be made much more difficult for men to get into women's spaces. You know, so I don't buy that argument.
But can you take on the point that trans people going into women's spaces, even if it makes people uncomfortable, which I can understand, even if you think it's wrong, that's not a significant contributing factor, and that somebody who's a rapist is not going to be bothered about self-ID one way or the other.
I can't remember how many examples are in that piece that started this conversation. I think
but 130.
Like 130, right? All of those men have multiple victims. Right? My argument is that not a single woman should be assaulted because a man got into their space because of self-ID. The correct number of victims of this type of thing is 0. That's the correct number. We will never make that number because men are canny and they get around things and they use everything they can to get into women's spaces and to get access to women. But it's being made easier by an incoherent, contradictory concept like self-ID. You know, that's the problem. If you're talking about transsexuals, yes, there's a conversation to be had. But as soon as you say transgender, you're opening it up to everyone who just wants to say they're transgender.
At this point, we briefly lost William's microphone, but William asked a question to Graham if there was anything else he wanted to say on this topic.
You may be in a position at the moment, because of your relative happiness in life, your comfort in life, where you'll never need a rape crisis shelter, or maybe you're not interested in playing sports, or you will never end up in prison. And all I'm asking is that people just try and think of those people, think of those women, you know, and also you will not really realize how much you need to be a part of this conversation until something happens to you. I know so many parents who are going through hell at the moment because their kid has decided they're the opposite sex and they're taking hormones that will shorten their life, destroy their bodies. And all they can do is watch helplessly as this happens. In Australia, you can be arrested for getting in the way of it. So I just want people, just please try and be better informed. Please try and look into some of the demonized women like Kathleen Stock and Julie Bindel and listen to what they're actually saying, because it's not what it's being painted as. And once you do, you'll just make it so much easier for this conversation to reach less of a pitch than it's been at today, for instance. That's what I would say.
Okay, I hear what you're saying. And what I think I would have to come back with on that is that it seems very clear to me that even if it's nothing got to do with you, and I accept that it has, there is no question that there is a very virulent, hard right-wing group who are absolutely gleeful at weaponizing this issue. And
that's another good reason for progressive people to enter the conversation. At the moment, what's happening is that women like, for instance, Helen Steele, who's a long-time left-wing campaigner, she was in I don't know if you remember the McLibel trial, where she took on McDonald's on her own and won. Long-time environmental left-wing woman is portrayed as if she's like Michael Knowles and all these people. These are people who want to be on the left and they're being rejected, you know? So all I'm saying is just if people could open their ears and just try and look past the normal way they get information and see what's actually happening. I don't know. It'll just make the whole conversation easier.
Oh, okay, but to take into account, for example, in places like Tennessee and Florida, there are Republicans putting in laws which they are billing as anti-trans or anti-drag queen laws, which essentially make it illegal for a man to wear makeup in the presence of a child. Now, I don't know if you went to the Gaiety Theatre when you were a kid and went to the pantomime and had Widow Twankey and all of that. Would you accept that those people, those very, very hard right Republicans in the US, are doing everything that they can to hype up this issue, and that you creating distance between them and yourself would make it an awful lot easier for people to be allied to you?
Well, I don't know. I don't Widow Twankey doesn't call themselves, blowjob.
No. But Widow Twankey under laws, Graham, under laws being proposed in Florida and Tennessee, they could receive significant prison sentences for the type of thing that I saw in the Gaiety.
This is exactly why progressives need to be part of this conversation, because when progressives stay out of the conversation, the right just occupies the space.
Isn't the reverse true as well?
Is overcorrection. Overcorrection is going to keep happening until progressives join into this.
But Graham, isn't it the case that when people you call progressives stay out, that is leaving the field open to people on the hard right, but equally that the failure to distinguish themselves, people perhaps like you and J.K. Rowling and people, who would have been, we would certainly call progressives, showing up on Fox News to be interviewed very sympathetically when they give anti-trans views. Is that helping?
Wait, sorry, who's interviewing who in this scenario?
When people who previously might have been regarded as progressives show up on things like Fox News to be interviewed very sympathetically as long as they're giving anti-trans views, would you not agree that...
Let me ask you a question, William.
No, answer my question.
I'm answering with an answer.
Go ahead.
Or with a question. When did you last see Julie Bindel or Kathleen Stock on the BBC News?
Not very often. Kathleen Stock several times. I think the BBC have covered that relatively well.
Around the time she was getting abused, but they don't use her as a commentator. They don't have any feminists on. because there's no platform for feminists on these mainstream channels. The only place they can go to are places like Fox News and places like GB News. Do you think they should go, okay, well, I can't get on the BBC. I guess I'll just give up fighting for my daughter to have to be safe in the changing room? No. The important thing is to get across to as many people as possible to stop this happening, to protect women. That's the important thing. I don't give a fuck about tribalism at the moment. I'm disgusted at the left for how they've betrayed women. And while this is going on, I'll use every channel I can to get across to people.
Graham Linehan, the creator of Father Ted and many other famous TV shows, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you, William.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Graham Linehan at Glinner, and get in touch if you want to suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. Thanks again to all of the patrons on Patreon. Covers the costs of keeping the podcast going, and if you can throw in a couple of euros once or twice a month, please do go and sign up at patreon.com/here'show. That link is on the website. Also there you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All of that information is at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by William Campbell. The co-producer is me, Kevin Wolf. Thank you for listening.